Thank you. We have, as political groups, as members of the International Trade Committee of this House, invited you to this press conference, as today the INTA Committee has voted on the European Union-Colombia Peru Free Trade Agreement. And we just wanted to give you also the understanding of the position certain members of this committee has taken. As we think, my name is Helmut Scholz, I'm from the GUE-NGL group and the coordinator of our group in the International Trade Committee, that this vote was taken against the advice of trade unions and human rights organizations. And we tried, after the October session, where we already discussed the final conclusions concerning this FTA, to give beyond the representatives from the states, the governments, through the ambassadors and other diplomatic representatives here in Brussels, the chance also to trade unions and human rights organizations to take their point of view on this free trade agreement. And therefore we invited them today here, after the voting in the committee, to give the floor to Isabelle Hoferlin from the ETUC and CES trade unions. Then we have also invited Rocio Silva. She is National Coordinator for Human Rights of Peru organization, and Vicente Vallies from OIDHACO. And I tried to give a chance not only to hear my point of view on this occasion, but also to invite Keller, a member for the Greens-EFA group in the European Parliament, to take part in the press conference. And I think that also Richard Howitt from S&D group is participating in our today's press conference. As time is pressing, I want to be very short. I want to inform you that today, with 20 yes votes, 1 abstention and 4 no votes, the Greens and our group, the INTA Committee, has given green light to this FTA. And that means that if the plenary will take the respective vote in the plenary in December, then automatically a preliminary coming in force of the agreement will take place. So that's why I think it is very important to have today also the opportunity to stress our point of view on this FTA. And I want to clearly say that the INTA Committee's recommendation that the European Parliament gives its consent is bad. It's a wrong decision that has to be corrected in plenary or by the national parliaments of the European Union, as it is a mixed agreement. And the impact assessment study ordered by the Commission itself confirms clearly that such an agreement would increase pressure on land and other natural resources at the expense of poor, destroy more jobs in Spain and in the outmost regions of Europe, and destroy some national economic sectors in Colombia and Peru, such as the dairy, and we see just now the protest of the European milk farmers, financial services industries, by facilitating money laundering. So we have a complex of questions and issues linked to this FTA, which has a direct impact on the life situation in the countries having signed this agreement, meaning Peru and Colombia, as well as all member states of the European Union. And beyond this, this agreement has violated the original approach of the EU Commission to deal on regional basis with trade cooperation, with trade of international actors and stakeholders, and with the conclusion of this agreement, the chance for a strengthening of the regional cooperation of the N community is also hampered down. I want to give the floor just now to our guests from the trade unions, and I would suggest that after the speech of our guest, Keller from the Greens and Richard from S&D would take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Scholz, for giving us the floor in this very important opportunity. I represent the International Trade Union Confederation, and this intervention has been prepared along with the ETUC, European Trade Union Confederation, TUCA, Trade Union Confederation of the Americas, and in full coordination with the unions in Colombia and Peru. So all at large, the ITUC represent more than 170 million members and several millions in Peru and Colombia alone already. So today, the unions can just express their concern, disappointment. Maybe we condemn the MEP support for the Colombia-Peru FTA agreement. Our position is no secret. Indeed, the unions have been opposed to this trade deal because it did not adequately address the continuing violence and harassment of trade unionists and human rights defenders, particularly in Colombia, and it lacked measures to ensure the compliance with international labor rights. In Peru, let's not forget that the ILO has also recently published a report following the meeting of the Committee on Freedom of Association expressing the concern for the serious violation of freedom of association in that country, so it's not Colombia alone. So at the request of the European Parliament's committee, the two governments presented some roadmaps on human rights and environmental protection, as you know, but it was done without any consultation with the local trade union confederations. The colleagues from Colombia and Peru came to the EU, expressed their concern about the situation, presented positions, but today we don't find that those positions are fully responded or addressed in the two documents presented by their government. In Colombia, as we said, CUT, CGT, CTC have not been invited to discuss the proposal. Participation has also been lacking in Peru. The text proposed by the Peruvian government refers to a national agreement, Acuerdo Nacional. In fact, many unions have not been taking part in that national agreement, as well as many CSOs, civil society organizations. Besides, the text refers to an economic and social committee. As a matter of fact, the truth is that this ECOSOC does not exist today. Even the union have called repeatedly for the launch of that ECOSOC. So in general, we would say that the two roadmaps do not address essential concerns and concrete binding measures as raised by the unions. On issues like the following: freedom of association and collective bargaining, including for temporary workers. In Colombia, if I'm not mistaken, 3 million out of the 18 million workers have the right to organize in trade unions. It means that several million workers by law have no right to join unions. So it's just one point to mention that there are serious flaws in the law, but we can mention many, as the ILO has repeatedly put forward on the table in the many discussions. In Peru also, the current labor law has some serious flaws. There are problems with labor inspection, not addressed in the two roadmaps presented by Peru and Colombia. Same for the implementations on measures on social dialogue. Same for the impunity to address violence against trade unionists in Colombia, or to address the many social conflicts that exist and have existed over the last months in Peru, including with the indigenous communities. Also, problem with the protection of environment in full consultation with the unions, not addressed definitely in the documents. The same for some reparation or remedies to address the damage caused to indigenous communities in Peru. So in short, we have asked for binding and measurable commitments in the two documents duly prepared with the social partners in those countries, and those are definitely lacking. So the international trade union movement is united in this call, was united in the call for a vote against the FTA, and repeats its position. To do otherwise would disregard the appalling human rights record in Colombia and continued labor violations in Peru. It would also damage the EU's reputation as a leading force in the promotion of human rights and basic freedoms. This is what the unions state altogether today. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good evening. My name is Rocio Silva, and I am the chief in charge of a network of 78 NGOs. We are working about human rights. And now in Peru, the social protest has been extremely restricted by regulations, banning different kinds of manifestation and allow the armed forces to repress civil protesters. The legislative decree 1095 allows also the armed forces to use lethal weapons during the social conflicts. Our institution, the Coordinadora, is fighting in the justice to declare this decree unconstitutionality. Ollantumala, our president, have achieved more than 20 Peruvian dead during social conflicts. All these persons have been killed by the police or the armed forces using lethal weapons, war guns such as AKM, or an excessive number of non-lethal weapons. From July to October this year, we reported 2 underage kids killed by the state agents. We have also reported a high number of people injured or with irreversibility damage. The higher number of dead people are civilians, of course, like during the violence between the 80s in my country. The people in Lima demands a harder answer to the protest and an extreme use of fire weapons. This situation reveals the huge contradictions in our society. Yesterday, my ambassador said here that the Conga mining company was suspended and the dialogue between farms and the government is ongoing. That is not true. Now the dialogue is suspended and the work inside the mining deeps are continuing. So we can express our worry about this human rights situation in my country, and we could visibility these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, and just for Vicente, take the floor.
Thank you very much to all of the MEPs present here for their work on human rights in Colombia and to promote a discussion, a real discussion on trade relations between the EU and Colombia and Peru. Today, at the time of voting, 21 MEPs appear to not have listened to civil society. Yesterday, the members of the Committee on International Trade, before the vote, wondering if in Colombia, in terms of human labor and environmental rights, the glass is half full or half empty. As a network from more than 30 European, Swiss and Norwegian organizations and networks, our answer is clear. The glass is almost empty. Between January and September this year, 235 human rights defenders were attacked, 37 murdered, and 3 disappeared. Since 2010, the reports reflect an increase in these attacks. Is the glass getting empty? The Colombian government claims to fulfill with its obligation of prior consultation to tribal and indigenous people, protected by international conventions and the Colombian Constitution. Decisions of the Colombian Constitutional Court show the contrary in 2011 and 2012. The Colombian government, in a document submitted to the European Parliament, includes meetings with civil society organizations, among them OIDHACO, at the embassy as a result on human rights. Is this a way to fill a glass that is almost empty? Will the MEPs accept this? And if we put in the glass legislative measures, such as the military jurisdictions that, as raised by NGOs, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and UN rapporteurs, will consolidate impunity. Is the glass still getting full? According to different sources, Colombia has 97% of impunity. Do we really have to ask ourselves if the glass is half full or half empty? On November 15, indigenous authorities denounced against the destruction of their territories by world's largest open mining of coal, named the Cerrejón. For the 30 million tons of coal produced in 2011, The Cerrejón company has left approximately 300 million tons of wastes, dead land and destroyed ecosystem. In many cases, the response to communities' protests has been violent repression and threats. We remind that until September of this year, 78 indigenous people were killed. Another example is the forced disappearance and subsequent murder by paramilitaries of Miguel Ángel Pavón, 36 years old, father of 2 children, earlier this month. Miguel Ángel Pavón was fighting for the rights of communities whose living environment is affected by a hydroelectric dam. We have here, you can have it in the beginning of the room, we have here a letter signed by more than 160 organizations and rural community of Colombia, Peru, Latin America, and Europe, asking MEPs not to ratify the free trade agreement for the devastating impacts it will have on small-scale farming, on land and territories, on the environment, and on public services. Many are the voices of MEPs who speak about a follow-up of the impacts of the agreement. Once the ecosystem destroyed, what kind of monitoring will we do? Once indigenous peoples will disappear, what kind of follow-up will we do? Although we have little hope, we pray for MEPs to listen to this cry during the plenary and not to ratify the treaty. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot, Helmut. Thanks a lot for convening this press conference today. Indeed, it was a big disappointment for us earlier today that we have lost by such a clear majority, or rather minority on our side, this vote on the free trade agreement with Peru and Colombia. And that is even though we have together pointed out, like the 3 of us with other MEPs also involved, the difficulties of human rights, of labor rights in Peru and Colombia, of environmental issues in those 2 countries, even though we had a success in asking for a roadmap, but then what we got in the end as a roadmap from the 2 countries was far from being a roadmap, first of all, far from being measurable, verifiable, including such verifiable and measurable targets. So it's very disappointing that our concerns have not been taken up by our colleagues in the International Trade Committee. And for the Greens, it's very clear that we could not agree to such an agreement, first of all, of course, because of the human rights situation in Peru and Colombia, but second of all, also because of the far-reaching liberalization that is foreseen in this agreement, which puts some very general questions about how do we want to eradicate poverty? How do we deal with environmental standards? Because those issues are not being addressed by the FTA. It's only about liberalization, which goes against fighting poverty, which is, by the way, the main EU aim in our foreign policy. So apart from that, we also see that having this Peru-Colombia agreement rips apart a whole region. There was originally foreseen to have a regional agreement. That did not happen because other countries moved out for, I think, very understandable reasons. So this will actually deal a blow to regional integration, which I think is a very important thing for regional and local trade. Also in the area of raw materials and public procurement, this FTA gives important restraints to Peru and Colombia. But those 2 areas are very important for local development, for development also from the region itself. If you do not have the power to regulate your raw materials area or your public procurement, then you're not being able to, for instance, have an industrial policy. You're not able to fight poverty with your own income. As was already mentioned, involvement of civil society and also the parliaments did not really happen. This FTA does not only deal with goods, it also deals with, for instance, IPR, intellectual property rights, and also services. So it goes very far, and it goes even further than WTO regulations. And that is very problematic and puts a lot of requests and requirements on those two countries. And if we look at the areas where tariffs will be reduced, we're looking into things like, for instance, meat going to the EU, because the Europeans unfortunately consuming a lot of that, but that will also deal a heavy blow to Peruvian and Colombian environmental issues, the water issues, etc. On the other hand, Europe wants to export a lot of milk, so there the tariff quota will be then very low as well, because we're not being able to deal with our own milk problem here within the European Union. And if we also look at other areas, financial services, etc., that there are a lot of requirements also that we should have learned lessons from the current euro crisis about better regulating banks, but that's not foreseen. Other areas include the investor-state dispute settlement issue, which puts a question to policy space both in the European Parliament as well as in Peru and Colombia in the parliaments. Data exclusivity, another issue that we fought against very heavily in other free trade agreements, which have been taken out of other free trade agreements, but in Peru and Colombia we can still find it, and that will be a problem for accessibility of cheaper medicines as well. These are just a very few areas where we find problems and concerns, that are reasons for why we as Greens voted against this agreement. There are many more. I hope we can still change something until the plenary vote, but for the moment it was very disappointing for us. Thank you.
Yeah, Richard Howitt, member of the Socialist and Democrat Group, but speaking today in my personal capacity, I have to say there are many of us in other groups in the Parliament who are extremely concerned about the Colombia-Peru Free Trade Agreement. And although there is a completely proper debate about the socio-economic impact of the agreement, my principal concern throughout has been the continuing gross violations of human rights in Colombia, meaning that it is very difficult at the moment, in my view, to justify ratifying this agreement. And I would have preferred, I still prefer, that the European Parliament uses its powers to delay ratification of the agreement until verifiable and concrete improvements in human rights take place within Colombia. This is a country that Amnesty International calls the most dangerous place to be a human rights defender, and this is a place that Isabelle and our colleagues in the International Trade Union Confederation call the most dangerous place in the world to be a trade unionist. It seems very strange to me that the European Union should choose it as one of the first countries in order to complete a free trade agreement in those circumstances. I welcome the peace talks that are going on at the moment. I love the country. I want peace and human rights for the country. But I also see some aspects within the country at the moment, for example, new measures to ensure non-prosecution of members of the armed forces who may themselves have been responsible for murders and other human rights violations. For example, exclusion of land restoration to people who have been thrown off their, peasants who have been thrown off their land by the state, that suggests that the state is not going in the right direction at present. Beyond that, I note the roadmap that has been put forward as a justification for passing the agreement, at least at the committee at the moment. But I note too, not simply the very important points we've heard from the trade unions about lack of consultation, but also that our colleagues in the United States Congress, who themselves were pressured in not dissimilar situation just a year ago to pass their own free trade agreement with Colombia, did so on the basis of an action plan, which now the AFL-CIO, the affiliate to the International Trade Union Confederation, regards as not having been implemented and honoured in terms of respect for trade unionists and for labour rights. And when in this Parliament we passed a resolution in the first part of this year on the so-called safeguard clause, we said as a Parliament that binding measures must be ensured to ensure respect for human rights, including labour rights within the country. And what I see in this roadmap that's been brought forward is not binding measures in the type that the European Parliament in plenary called for. So for all of those reasons, I am absolutely convinced that it is right to join my colleagues from the two groups who've organised this, and I thank you very much for doing so. Our colleagues, of course, from the human rights community in Peru, but particularly with whom I've worked for many years, to civil society represented by OIDHACO, and to our trade union friends, most importantly the trade unionists of Colombia, the CUT, and all of the trade unions that offer solidarity that Isabelle represents through her presence here today. And last week, Bernadette Sedol, the General Secretary of the European Trade Union Confederation, came to the Socialist and Democrat group of this Parliament, and I asked her in front of all the colleagues what was the position of the ETUC on this agreement, and she said she was against it. And that's why, as a trade unionist and a socialist myself, and someone who is proud to do so, I will continue to campaign against ratification of this agreement.
Thank you, Richard. So I would give the floor to you.
Brian Maguire, European Business Express. As I understand, the mixed agreement still gives you opportunity to kill this agreement, or at least delay it for some time. I know you mentioned national parliaments, but even some of the regional parliaments still have a voice. And if one of these parliaments anywhere across Europe declines to ratify it, then the whole deal is dead. So my question is really, what are your next steps? What do you plan to do next?
First of all, of course, we are struggling still in the European Parliament to get the plenary on another position as the committee has taken yesterday. But of course, we have also to spread our efforts together with the trade unions and civil and human rights organizations and movement throughout all member states of the European Union to increase the pressure on the national parliaments, to make aware what we are speaking about. So there are different positions concerning the FTA itself. So probably the Greens and we have certain aspects where we are focusing on labor standards, labor rights, ecological issues, etc., criteria, what would be dispute settlement if there is a dangerous situation arising. So I mean, this is a focus where other colleagues could and should not be agree with us. But as I would say, if we have not the response from the governments of both sides that they really are developing a roadmap or an action plan where the targets are clearly pronounced, and then we have a mechanism to prove what has been done. So only to explain what there had been done in the past and not linking it to the general current policies in the countries is not enough. So this must be explained to the public in our countries, in all member states, to the parliamentarians, so that there is an awareness what we are doing with this FTA.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
Many of the campaigners against the free trade agreement have said it's okay, we'll just go to the national parliaments, we'll find one to object. But what they, regrettably, there's a danger of overlooking is that the European Commission has said that they will bring in provisional application of the free trade agreement after the European Parliament has ratified. So although we may have a later victory that may in some years' time, I suppose, call for there to be a review, in reality, those who have sought the trade agreement will have got the effect of that after the European Parliament vote. And that's why it is absolutely essential that we still use every and any opportunity to try and build opposition so that the European Parliament does delay ratification of this agreement.
S'il n'y a pas d'autres questions des journalistes, je crois qu'on doit arrêter ici. Là, encore une? La dernière alors.
Thank you. Do you think that your colleagues in the Parliament have been willfully blind in terms of the level of destruction and the ecological destruction, the level of imbalance in social power within these countries as well? Do you think there's willful blindness on the part of your colleagues?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Of course, it's very difficult for us to answer that. But what we've been always hearing is that, from our colleagues, is that they find it extremely important to see the benefits of the European Union itself. For instance, this milk export. It's for them an important thing to do because it relieves the milk market here of some pressure. So it's more economic interests that override human rights concerns. That's my impression. I mean, you might have to ask them personally, but I can't really speak for the others. But I would say that really EU economic interest overrules other countries' economic interest and overrules human rights concerns. And unfortunately, this we can see time and time over again.
To add one remark, yesterday the embassy of Colombia distributed material explaining the current state of play of the balance of trade between both regions or countries. And that means that the EU is in a deficit, in the trade deficit with Peru and Colombia. So that means, of course, there's really a big economic interest of the European Union to get into the market in Peru and Colombia. So that means, on the other side, if you are saying there are other fields where we have to discuss, the Parliament just last week voted against the fracking. So that means there is also attention to other aspects of the economic development. So it means that we have to be more precise and to more concrete, telling our colleagues also in the Parliament what does it mean if we are agreeing to step 1 and the step 2 and step 3. I'm much in favor of having a mutual partnership with the countries when we are organizing our trade. But that means we have to recognize them as partners. And that means also that we have to include then in our thinking what does it mean for the real economic and social development in these countries. And finally, the citizens will judge if this decision is right or not. We are now facing a very complicated economic and financial situation within the European Union. That means we are also facing a very complicated economic, political situation in the countries we are just speaking about. Of course, I take notice that there are improvements in Colombia, but that does not mean that I'm satisfied with the way how the government are dealing with their responsibilities for the past in this country. So all these complex of issues, and that we have to address to our colleagues. I mean, that is a task, and I hope that we are able also to spread our awareness about this challenge to colleagues in other national parliaments, so that there is more to do, and that we have one step reached is not the last step, and the struggle goes on.
Yeah. Two answers very briefly. One is, those who argue against us say that this agreement will improve human rights because there's a human rights clause within it. But what they overlook is two things. One is there's a human rights clause in our existing agreement, right? And many of us feel that human rights clause is already being breached. And if the European Union's got no will to enforce its existing commitments jointly with Colombia on human rights, what credibility can it have in suggesting it would do so under the new agreement? More than that, those who argue against us say that we're trying to cut ourselves off from Colombia, that disengage, and that will have a detrimental effect on human rights. And that's not our position. This is about an enhanced trading relationship with Colombia. None of us are arguing for economic sanctions or the tearing up of the existing agreement whatsoever. And so the debate has been very distorted in the European Parliament in relation to that. And if we're talking about credibility, if the European Parliament is to use its new powers under the Lisbon Agreement to not ratify or to delay to ratify, what country in the world has got a worse human rights record that would prompt us to do so if we will not do so in relation to Colombia?